I joined up in Alstonville because at that period of time I was 19 and I had a hell of a job to persuade my dear mother to sign the papers for me, because she, being the eldest of the family, she was very dependent on me in that respect. And I had 5 sisters next to me, and being the eldest of the family, of course, a lot depended on me to be able to look after them, as well as transportation and what have you. And when all my schoolmates, of course, were around me, we all wanted to join up together, and that was all there was to it. I realised the seriousness of the situation because at that particular time, as you can recall from history, that the Japanese were raiding Sydney Harbour. We were losing ships along the coastline here at Ballina and Byron Bay, and it was at that period of time when Sister Savage was survived off the Centaur. It was all too close to us to be able to turn your back on it. I think every man and his dog was quite happy to see themselves in uniform. I was always petrified of water in terms of a watery grave. But I knew a lot of my friends were Navy men, but I had no love to be involved with sea life, I promise you. Because at that particular time we did 4 trips to and from New Guinea, and we were getting boat drill every night and morning because the submarines were chasing coastal shipping and we were under threat all the time. The elderly officers at Bathurst were very determined old gentlemen for us young fellows, because in that period of time you can imagine the intake that I went in with were all young fellows. There was no senior members, and you had to be very particular. They wouldn't release me to go on an early campaign because of my age. They were very stringent about that. The old officers were a bit hard to bear on the young fellows because they were First World War men, most of them. It was the makings of a lot of young fellows, because a lot of those city boys had not been brought up as the country lads were, and I suppose they were all a bit cheeky, but like all young fellows. But there again, the old officers had you under the thumb all the time. And of course, if you did the wrong thing, you paid. Huge numbers of Americans, and our fellows, of course, being old timers, got into no end of strife with them. There was a lot of unpleasantness there, even among the officers. Big punch-ups. To be truthful, it was something that a lot of us always avoided. If they went into town and started drinking, well, it wasn't everyone's aim to do that. And the younger fellows were a bit weary of this, and although it was a period of 2 weeks there, they did get into a lot of trouble. I realised that because fellows were coming back to camp after a blue in town. And I mean, Port Moresby was pretty uncomfortable at that stage because right in the middle of the port, a ship had been sunk, which meant that we had to be taken off our ship onto pontoons and taken ashore. At that period of time, we were housed right in Port Moresby till we were transferred up into a camp up into the hillsides, small camps that they established to receive the reinforcements, and those fellows coming back from hospital we were made central there until the time we were picked up and brought back to Townsville or to Brisbane. We were all doing our share in long hikes terrible lot of route marches there at that time. It's over through open country and highways, down the country roads. But it was a pretty tough period of time there because we all young and had little experience in terms of, after having left Bathurst, it's a terribly cold place. For fellows like that left the coast and went down there, it was a bitterly cold winter. Well, it was a misfortune in our respect because we were parked at the end of a runway in a convoy of trucks, transport trucks. We were there sitting in the trucks with everything on, as we read there, ammunition, rifles and every form of weaponry. And nobody ever expected such a tragedy, to think that the 11 men on that aircraft took off from the airstrip, little beknownst to us, and just came crashing through the trees on top of the transport. Well, sadly we lost 62 men in a flash, and the officers then, in their wisdom, called up what was left of us, because each one in turn were going around looking for a mate, and that was destroyed everyone. So the officers then called us up, and we boarded another small planes to go up into an American camp some distance up in the hills, a little place called Silly Silly. It was written down there. Silly Silly was an American base. We'd only spent a night or two there because it was, being an American camp, the bombers were looking for it, and they were not very particular about lights, these people up there, and they were all new Americans, hadn't seen the action, and as the planes kept coming over, so the next day or two we were moved on to go on patrol to Nadzab. The first afternoon we were there, these Japanese fellows had come within reach of us, and they had a small mountain gun which was firing fairly big shells, and overhead into the trees. They had our complete distance because of their ability to be able to track down where we were, and we were forewarned that night on guard duty, which was pretty nerve-wracking. Be careful if you hear the voice, "Hey Jack," you'd say yes, and Jack had ducked back to tell all his mates, and of course the next thing was we were under heavy fire. But that didn't happen though. We got on top of our fellows, were very well educated in that department, and they went out round them. And needless to say, my wife, later when I came home, my wife, her brother was with me, Joe Buckley. He was a member of the battalion, and bugger me, I saw him get shot in the leg as well. There was a lot of firing this afternoon. We were coming out of a situation where we were being withdrawn, and the nips were dug into the heavy undergrowth, and Joe got knocked off. He went to his grave with the shrapnel in his back from a Japanese mine that, while he was in the Owen Stanleys. He'd been in the Middle East too, Joe Buckley. Of course, once you went into action, the officers were never known as Sir. It was always just like Bernie and Jack, or Bernie and whatever. They were never allowed to make a nameplate. Only such thing, you spoke them as one, because the other fellows were always within ear reach, as you might say, to be able to pick them off. And if any of the spotters or those who were uh, under protection, always looking for someone out in front who was a leader. Having organised these reunions, those fellows were coming from South Australia to Lismore, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. Pat and I would do the bookings at the motels and then canvass the RSL club for a luncheon and have that all organised, and they'd spend a couple of days in Lismore with us around the place before they'd head back to their respective areas. It was a lifetime relationship. Those had just petered out at the end of the 33rd year. They were unfit to travel, these fellows. They were all older men, whereas we were still active. Our fellows, particularly local lads, but today there's none left. Not one in Lismore area, Grafton, those areas are all skinned out and passed on.
Not one left.
Brisbane is very thin with a few left members up there. Sydney, I noticed in Sydney, March this time, most of the families have joined behind the battalion now to fill the vacancies of their parents, and they march with the banner, 2nd, 33rd. Infantrymen, they never had a very stylish setup in terms of camp life was concerned, what little time we ever spent in a camp, because half the time when you're out training or out in action on patrols, you were living under a tree, a cover of trees, and they'd have an oven there with someone to prepare food for you, which was pretty much canned. There was never very fancy food, that was sure, but you didn't expect it. The fellows who were there, they didn't expect that anything to be flash about it, because you were toughened up to this life. And for that reason, I think that each one in turn accepted what they got, although it was mainly pretty straight cooking, whatever they'd heat up for you. Now, there was nothing about it in that department. You camped out with a ground sheet under you and cover over you, nothing more. Well, that was one of the big pitfalls of the battalion, malaria. And although you were under treatment for it, it was always a risk of someone getting, even if those that were on treatment were still going down with it. And I had a relapse of a recurrent variety B2 malaria. I came home on leave in one period and I did 2 trips to Lismore Base Hospital. The only base hospital at Lismore was the government, and a government officer there to treat you. But it was something that took a long time to get out of the system. We all learned to smoke pretty much there, and one of the jokes there were that for some reason or other the department issued us with condoms, packet of condoms. But of course all the condoms were used for was to put your tobacco and matches in to keep, because half the time we were crossing rivers and creeks, and in wet conditions, the only thing you could do to keep the tobacco and matches dry was in a condom.
Very clever.
You always had a ground sheet to give you some protection, but that wasn't everything though. I mean, there were times when you would be wet to the hide, like socks and boots full of water, that sort of thing, because it was never a time to take your boots off to cross a river or a creek you ploughed in the way you were on a rope across the. Someone would go to get a rope across to safeguard the other fellows. Scrub typhus was a thing that was very prolific among it's the lice of rats. When you were sleeping out in the grass at night, there were rat-infested areas there, and the lice off the rats would get into you, bite you, and you developed out of that scrub typhus. I was admitted to hospital with scrub typhus and malaria, and my friend from the casino passed away in the bed alongside me. He was very ill. We were both taken back to Dobajura to the second 8th AGH, and there were mainly women there. Some of them Victorian nurses were very helpful there to us because we hadn't seen much of nurses in the time we were there. Now, I well remember, as far as being seriously ill there with it, it was something that people, the fellows in the ward were taking bets as to when you went into isolation, who would come out and who wouldn't. So you'd be on that list very quickly. And like some Aboriginals, or the islanders in New Guinea, of course, they were very keen on us fellows because we could exchange a packet of tobacco or cigarettes for them while they'd deal in something like fruit for us. They'd have well-maintained camps. They'd have pawpaws and fruit that we would delight to get our hands on that the cooks couldn't give you. And we'd be exchanging cigarettes for those type of fruit. Oh yes, there was a number of aircraft shot down around us. Of course, anyone of a night that lit a cigarette, you had to do it under a blanket or under something, because from an aircraft they'd say to you the side of a match would be the size of that frame there, and of course that gave the whole show away. They delight in coming round of a night. They'd not so much of day travel, but nights you're always on the alert. A number of times there they would raid a camp, but it'd be a bit short of the camp, direct hit though, or something like that. They'd destroy a vehicle of some description. But it was certainly always on your mind to be able to, of course we began to get very alert then to the sound of different aircraft. But you were just lucky to get away with life there, because once they were there dug in. Oh, well, something I never forgot was the first morning we went into action. This gentleman was with me, the officer. He said to me, "Come with me." He used to call me Shorty. There was Shorty, and another fellow from Lisbon was Stumpy Slade, and I was Shorty. And he's "Come with me, Shorty." And we went up to a huge log. It was so high. And there were two men of the 25th Battalion. They were part of our battalion. Both shot there. And when we looked around, the nips had dug under this log, and there they were under the log waiting for us to come up. And I remember Rick Marshall cut the tags off their neck and put them in his pocket to take them with him to report them. But it was the first morning of action, and I learnt the hard way. It wasn't a very welcome sight, I promise you. Those sort of things I find today, and I can talk about it now, seem to stick in your mind. They're fresh as if it was happening this morning, but you get over a lot of that nowadays. an unfortunate experience there. I hadn't been home for 18 months. And when I came home, I was advised, and my mother was in the Mater Hospital in Brisbane with cancer. But the doctors had advised them never to tell me because of the situation I was in. So the next day or so I went straight to Brisbane with my family, and Dr. Lars was treating Mum in Brisbane, and he said to me, "I don't want you to leave Australia. You'll only hasten your mother's death." And I said, "Well, what's the next move?" He said, "You'll have to apply immediately to get help, to help your father on the property." Well, I went through 6 months of trying to get done through a gentleman at Lismore, who was a sergeant at Lismore, Bede Clark. He was trying his damnedest to get results for me, and nothing happened. And my mother was still in the hospital in Brisbane, and of course it broke the family up altogether. My sisters were all, some of them were still at school, and I went ac willy. I didn't go back. And then I went to the local police and told him what I was doing, and he said, "Bern, something we never do, but I'll give you a letter of reference because of your behaviour and knowing your family so well." Bill Bottrell, he was the sergeant at Olsenville, and I waited at home until either someone of authority notified them that I was absent without leave, and two of the officers came out one night in a van, and my dad brought them in and sat them down to have a coffee or meal, and they said to me, "Go and get your gear, mate." No funny business. I said, "No." I had to go to the shed and get my rifle and my gear, my clothing, get dressed up, and went off with them. I went to Lismore. From there we went back to Brisbane the next day. Well, it was 4 or 5 that had picked up at the same time. Fellows had been out ac willy for some time. So anyway, I had to go for a court-martial then because of the time, and the officer I had as defendant for me said nothing. He was a very, he could have told a lot of help, got me out of the problem, but I got 3 months then to go into a training establishment at Bathurst, I think it was, something like that. Anyhow, the old officer said to me, "Bernie, you're leaving here today. You're a good soldier. I don't want to see you again." Well, bugger me, I only got back to camp, and they said to me, I was getting RTU, return to unit, and they were just in the last throes of Maritime Union Island, and they said to me, "There's a message here that no more reinforcements are to go to the battalions, finished, it's all over." So I had to wait then to the process of getting discharged, just the normal, and came back to Lismore on the train that night or the next morning, and I walked away from it all. But it was a disappointment though for the family. Were not concerned about it because they knew the situation that I was in, and the death of my mother, pending death, because the family were just over the moon that I was home. The situation then, sir, was that every man and his dog, my mum, dad and the kids were all deeply involved with the war effort. Country people particularly, and I mean city people were all working, because there was such a shortage of manpower. And the loss of those, the number of fellows that were lost during the war years, like some of those airmen I knew, still never found their planes down there somewhere. They never found again. But for most of those young people, they were all family orientated and that sort of thing, country folk. Broke a lot of homes, there's no doubt. As where it made some men, it broke others. I saw fellows on Central Railway Station, country blokes, who were just going from one to the other, biting people for money that they'd spent on the booze and that sort of thing. Never sober. They just drank day and night. So that those country fellows really did it the hard way, there's no doubt. You couldn't help them. But there again, I had neighbours of mine who were former POWs, and as I said, one of the girls sat down at the table. I pushed the rice off the table one night. We're having dinner together, him and I. And he said to me, "Don't you like rice?" And I said, "No, Joe." He said, "Kept me alive for 3 bloody years." He said, "You better stick to it." And I realised then just how it meant to him compared to me. But he was a very good neighbour, that particular one bloke anyhow. There was